Welcome back to Down the Rabbit Hole. Today we are going to be talking about the Villisca murder house in Iowa. If you're new here, hit that like button, hit that bell for notifications. Also, please subscribe. Help a girl out. Um, anyway, so what exactly happens in Iowa? Here's some things I know. They have several Amish communities. Also has a history of a Mormon community as well. And did you know that Iowa is the leading producer in soybeans, beef, pork, and grain? I didn't. That's pretty cool right there. In fact, it is also believed that one Iowa family can produce enough food and fiber to feed 279 people. It has 83 state parks, including Backbone State Park, Ledger's History, and Ledger's State Park, the Mosquito Grave State Park, the Iowa State Park, and many opportunities for outdoor recreation. It is also, in historical sense, Iowa was one of the was part of the Missouri Territory in 1812. The Black Heart War took place in Iowa in 1831. Explorers Lewis and Clark traveled through Iowa in 1804 on their way to the Pacific, and the world's first electronic digital computer was built and operated in researchers at the Iowa State University. Now, pretty interesting, honestly. Here I was thinking Iowa was just one of those passing through states. Anyway, So, and here's something that really also happened is the Villisca axe murder, which honestly this could be used on my true crime, but we're gonna put it on my down the rabbit hole. Which occurred between the evening of June 12th, 1912, and the early morning of June 10th, 1912, in Villisca, Iowa, where the six members of the Moore family had and two guests were found bludgeoned in the Moore residence. All eight victims, including six children, had a severe head wound with an axe, and a lengthy investigation yielded several suspects, one of which was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and the second ended in an acquittal. What about the details? Well, the victims consisted of parents Josiah B., Sarah, and their children, Herman Montgomery, Mary Catherine, Arthur Boyd, and Paul Vernon. An affluent family, and the Moores was well-known and well-liked in the community. So on June 9th, 1912, Mary Catherine invited Ina May and Lena Guthrie Stillinger to spend the night at the Moore residence. And that evening, the visiting girls in the Moore family attended a Presbyterian church where they participated in the Children's Day program, while Sarah had coordinated after the program had ended at 9:30. Now, the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moore house, arriving between 9:45 and 10. So, how did the crime get discovered? Well, at 7 a.m. the next day, Mary Pecker, the Moore's neighbor, became concerned about when she noticed the family had not come out for their morning chores. Peckman knocked on the door, and when nobody answered, she tried to open the door and discovered it was locked. Now, she let the Moore's children out and called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, like Peckman, and Moore received no response, in which he knocked the door and shouted. Ross unlocked the front door with his copy of the house while Peckman stood at the door. Ross went into the parlor, opened the guest bedroom, and when he found Ina and Lena Stillinger's body in the bed, immediate more immediately told Peckman to call Henry Hake Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, who arrived shortly thereafter. And Horton searched for the house to reveal that the entire Moore family um, and the two Stillinger girls have been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon was an axe belonging to Josiah and was found in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters were found. Now, doctors concluded that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. Two spent cigarettes in the attic suggested that the killers patiently waited in the attic until the Moore's family and the guests were asleep. The killers began the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah were sleeping. Josiah received more blows to the axe than any other victim, and his face had been cut to such an extent that His eyes were missing, and the ceiling in his room um had a gouge mark from where the murderer lifted the axe and murdered him. Um, so with that being said, well, my computer's doing something stupid, y'all. Hang on. Anyway, there we go. Um, the killer or killers used the blade of the axe on Sarah while using the blunt object at the end, and Herman, Mary, Catherine, Arthur, and Paul were next killed in the head when the same manner of their parents, and afterwards the murderer returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows to the head to the elder Morse, knocking on over a shoe that had filled with blood before moving downstairs to the bathroom, killing Ina and Lena. And seemingly afterwards, a 4 pound slab of bacon was taken out of the icebox and laid next to an axe. And investigators also felt an untouched foot and bloody water during the search. And after the search, people were let in to see if they could have who committed the crime, completely contaminating the weapon. Now, investigators believe that all the victims, except for Lena Stillinger, had been asleep while murdered. They thought they thought that she was awake and tried to fight back, as she had been lying crosswise and everything. Her nightgown was pushed up to her waist, and she was wearing no undergarments, leading law enforcement to speculate the killer sexually molested her in an attempt to do so. This was later proven false. Now let's talk about the investigation for a moment. Um, Over time, many people suspects emerged, including Reverend George Kelly, Frank F. Jones, Glasting Mansfield. I wonder if she's in relation to James Mansfield. Anyway, um, Loving Loving Mitchell, Paul Mueller, Henry Lee Moore, no relation, and Kelly was tried twice for the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and the second he was acquitted. And other possible suspects in the investigation were exonerated. Now let's talk about some of the suspects. We have Andrew Sawyer, who was a transient and was unaccounted for a strangler and was the suspect of the murders. Andrew Sawyer was one of those people who was interrogated but not charged, but also obsessed with the murders and slept fully clothed as if he was going to get a clean getaway, and also slept with an axe by his head. Next was Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born minister in the town on the night of the murders, and Kelly was described as a peculiar, reported having suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent, and as an adult he was accused of peeping and several times asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. Now, on June 8, 1912, he came to Villisca to teach at the Children's Day service, which the Moore family attended that day, and he left at 5 a.m. and 5:50 p.m. a.m. on June 10, 1912, and but the hours before the bodies were discovered. Now, Reverend Kelly had confessed to the murders in court, but the jury did not believe his confessions. He was the town pervert, and he was also part of the murder. Like seriously, he confessed. Like anyway. Now, in the weeks followed, he displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to police, investigators, and families of the deceased. This aroused suspicion, and the PI wrote back to Kelly, asking him the details the minister might know about the murders. Kelly replied with great details, claiming that he had heard several sounds and possibly witnessed the murders, and his known mental illness authorities may have questioned whether he knew about the details and everything. And in 1914, 2 years after the murder, Kelly was arrested, sending obscene material through the mail. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Hospital in D.C., where investigators speculated that again that Kelly could have murdered the Moore family. In 1917, he was arrested for the murders, and police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed by many interrogations, and Kelly later recanted. After two separate trials, he was acquitted. Another one of the suspects was Frank F. Jones. Jones was a Villisca resident and Iowa state senator, and Josiah Moore had worked for Jones as to implement store for many years before leaving the store, and Moore reportedly took business away from Jones, and including his successful John Deere dealership. And Moore was rumored to have a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no evidence support this. Now, another suspect was Gladys W. Mansfield. I really want to know if she's related to James Mansfield so bad, honestly. But another theory was that Senator Jones hired Gladys William Mansfield to murder the Moore family. 9 months after the murders in Villisca, a similar case of an axe murder occurred in Colorado Springs, where two axe murderers followed Ellsworth, Kansas, Palolo, Kansas, and the cases were similar, though, enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person. Ugh. Now, sorry y'all, I'm just tired. I've been working with nothing but straight doubles all week, so yeah. But other murders reported as possible being linked to these crimes, including numerous unsolved axe murders, the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1911 and 1912, and the unsolved axeman in New Orleans killman, as well as several others. Now, the murders in Colorado Springs were closely related to the execution of the Morehouse. And H.C. Wayne, his wife, and Mrs. A.J. Berman were found dead. Murdered with axes, bed sheets were in the covers and everything. To prevent bypassers from looking in. Now, at the Morehouse, the murderer hung aprons and skirts over the windows. And as the murders in the Villisca, the murders in Colorado Springs wiped the blood from the axe, covered the heads with the victims of their own bedclothes. Now, Mansfield was also the prime suspect in the Burns Detectives Agency in Kansas City, and Detective James Newton Wilkinson, who suggested that he was a cocaine addict, according to a contemporary news report. And Wilkinson believed that Mansfield, um, sorry, I've been saying she, but he, still. Anyway, my apologies. But Wilkinson believed that Mansfield was responsible for the axe murder of a wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, on July 5th, 1914. Now, according to the Wilkinson investigation, all the murders were convicted precisely in the same manner, and everything. In each case, the murderer avoided leaving fingerprints, gloves, and everything, so he had an M.O. So, however, Wilkinson managed to convince a grand jury in the investigation in 1916 that Mansfield was arrested, brought to Montgomery County for Kansas City. Payroll records, however, provided his alibi and everything else. However, R.H. Thorpe, the restaurant owner in Shenandoah, Iowa, identified Henry Mansfield, um, identified Mansfield as the man he saw that morning. So, who was the other suspects? Well, we have Henry Lee Moore, who was a suspected SK, who was also convicted of murder of his mother and grandmother and everything. We have Samuel R. Moyer. Um, in that his inquest, it was reported that Samuel Warnell Morrill was Josiah's brother-in-law and often threatened to kill Josiah. Paul Mueller in 2017, um, Paul Mueller was also not a suspect, and in 2017, um, there was a book called A Man from the Train. Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James discussed their murders. Um, and everything, and they conclude that the murder was Paul Mueller, an immigrant possibly from Germany, with the subject of unsuccessful year-long manhunt and everything. It is believed that the killer selected families who lived nearby and everything. And always a sexual motive. Now, that is it for this episode. I will see y'all next time. Y'all have a great day.